talk to your customer success team, probably more than you do today, and at least as much as you talk to sales. The CS team is in the front lines. They're dealing with the realities of what's happening. They're the ones literally talking to customers all day. And so I do think that CS will be the best source of truth for PMMs around what's actually going on and what is the voice of the customer.
You are listening to This is Product Marketing, brought to you by Product Marketing Hive, the product marketing community that gives back. In this episode, Crispin Reed and Adam Houghton, Vice President of Customer Success at Klue, discuss the intersections of customer success and product marketing, and how can product marketers excel at competitive intelligence. Let's dive into it right now.
Welcome to today's episode of This is Product Marketing. My guest today is Adam Houghton. Adam is Vice President of Customer Success at Klue, and Klue is a competitive intelligence software company. So this is great because I've been meaning to have a chat about customer success and also about competitive. So great to have you here on the show, Adam.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited for the conversation.
So maybe we could start with customer success, because I seem to have been in the software industry for long enough that I remember before there was a function called customer success. And I was thinking about this earlier today and I thought, I wonder if the reason for that was that back in the days when people didn't sell subscriptions, they actually cared a little bit less than they do today about customer success. Not to say they didn't care, because there was still important revenue streams that came from maintenance revenues and stuff. But in the old days, it wasn't a subscription model, and so customer success wasn't at least as critical to the success of a company as it is today. So maybe you can start by describing, how do you define customer success? How does customer success differ from customer support? One of the things I'm a bit curious about is, where do you draw the lines these days, right? Because there's a lot that I suppose you could put into customer success. You could include support. Yeah. If someone is obsessed with the success of a customer, then where is the line between that and selling as well? Yeah. So where do those boundaries sit today in organizations between sales and support?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say probably the classic answer you're going to get on the how is customer success different from support is the reactive versus proactive response. So generally, I see support as more about break fix and then also quick transactional interactions with customers. So the emergence of online chat is a great example of that. Customers expect speed. They want to be able to self-serve. And I think these are areas for support to continue to invest in. Whereas customer success is, at least the customer success management function, is more about relationship development and ongoing product adoption and things like that. And then on the sales side, the way that I think about it is sales is really about selling a promise, and customer success is about delivering on that promise. So the customer continues to buy. And so there is a sales component of customer success for sure, because the customer is, especially in a SaaS model, is basically renting your software. And you want them to continue to buy, to invest, to provide advocacy, which leads to second order revenue and references and all that kind of fun stuff. And all of those are key to any SaaS business for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. A lot of our audience are folks in product marketing, and we'll be talking in a minute about competitive, but just sticking with the topic of customer success for a minute. What are the sort of best practices that you can think of for how customer success should work with product marketing? What are the interaction points?
Yeah, that's a great one. I think so whenever you're dealing with, and for product marketers, whenever you're dealing with any internal customer, and they have a lot of those, it's always important to try to understand what job are they actually trying to get done. And I think product marketers are generally quite good at that kind of stuff. And they're in this really unique position where they're working across sales and marketing and product and customer success. So my advice on that would be to talk to your customer success team, probably more than you do today, and at least as much as you talk to sales. The CS team is in the front lines. They're dealing with the realities of what's happening in the sales process, the realities of product releases and feedback, overall positioning, messaging. They're the ones literally talking to customers all day. And so I do think that CS will be the best source of truth for PMMs around what's actually going on and what is the voice of the customer.
Good perspective. So let's get into competitive intelligence, because this is a topic that we haven't really been covering much in Product Marketing Hive yet. But I would like to get into it more because it's clearly fairly central to product marketing. We'll talk more about that. But let's sort of start at the beginning with what is competitive intelligence?
Yeah, I mean, at the core, it's this whole end-to-end process of collecting and analyzing and trying to synthesize intel about your market, your product, your competitors. And in a nutshell, that's what CI is. And then trying to understand what information is actually relevant and helpful to my internal customer.
And who are they? I mean, what's the sort of fundamental purpose of CI, and who are the internal customers?
Yeah, so the ones that were touched on before, so revenue teams, sales, and more so customer success teams now, for sure. Product teams, strategy teams, executives, marketing, external partners as well. So if you're an organization that has channel partners, those folks need some competitive intel as well, so they can better sell and position your products. So pretty much everyone who touches the go-to-market function is going to be a customer for product marketers.
I do think this when I've been involved in CI, I sort of tend to think of, all of those constituencies could be stakeholders, but I still pretty much always had a primary focus on sales. And I think the reason for that is that the product guys kind of end up doing their own anyway, because they consider rightly, if you're a product manager, you consider that part of your basic job responsibility is understanding the competition. So they tend to do that anyway in their own ways. Yep. Whereas the salespeople don't usually, except in very large organizations with big sales enablement teams, but usually they don't have a capacity to go and do the competitive analysis themselves.
Yeah. So I think for us, like myself and definitely at Klue, like you'll hear us talking about competitive enablement. And so we see that as the coming together of competitive intelligence and revenue enablement. And it's all about helping enterprises win more business. And so you can have a direct impact on winning deals and enabling reps to better position. More reps hitting quota is a good thing for obviously every business. And then also informing products on product strategy, feature functionality that might be gaps in the current space for them. And so I do think that's a longer path to influencing revenue, but at the end of the day, it's because they're tied to go-to-market. It's all about revenue.
Right. And so CI people then, where do they go get this competitive intelligence? Where do they look for it?
Yeah, I think, at a high level, there's really two places. It's external and internal. And external, I think, is the classic way CI has been done. So what can we get from the public web? What can we get from places like review sites, those types of things, research analysts. And then more and more, we're seeing a lot of the value coming from internal resources. And part of this is because of how work is changing. So much information exists in places like Slack or Microsoft Teams, where companies have competitive intelligence channels. So much information exists in revenue intelligence platforms like the Gongs and the Choruses of the world, where transcripts are saved and analyzed. And that's a goldmine of information that previously might have been more difficult to tap into, at least at scale. So if you're a product marketer or a CI person, you can't possibly sit on every single call. But with these types of technologies, you have the ability to try to capture all that information and try to track trends, themes, things like that you can then enable your sellers on.
And where do you see, how do you see CI being organized in teams today? I guess sometimes competitive intelligence can be part of product marketing, sometimes it's not. What do you see?
Yeah, so for us, and because most of our customers are SaaS companies, or at least technology companies, the CI responsibility usually does sit somewhere in product marketing. So it might be part of the product marketer's job, or it might be a dedicated CI person, but they do tend to live in the product marketing team. In those bigger companies, we generally see a CI analyst or CI expert. They might be more tied to deal support, so they're helping reps win one-off deals, as opposed to product marketers who have a much broader scope and their enablement is probably a little more generalized.
So how big does a company need to be before it sort of starts to have full-time? Because I guess there'll be two ways of doing this, right? You could either have, competitive is a small part of the jobs of a few product marketing managers that you have in the company, or it could be, hey, I have, as in the example you gave, a full-time CI analyst. How big of an organization does it need to be before you go full-time on CI, do you think?
Yeah, well, I think the answer from Klue's perspective is going to be everyone needs a full-time competitive enablement resource because every business has competitors. But I think the reality is, like in tech, there's so much demand that we're seeing as well from earlier stage companies. They have product marketing as a function probably earlier, I would say, and realize they need to prioritize competitive enablement because there's so many competitors and the landscape gets busy really quick. So we think that companies need to be rethinking how they approach when to hire their first PMM and when to have that person focus on compete content, because the scope of that role is so broad, and then it becomes a prioritization game. Like how do you know who to, like what you should be spending your time on that's going to maximize short and long-term goals, which is always a juggling act for PMMs. But generally, we see companies at 50 employees having product marketing resource, and other times it takes to like 150 or 200 people. But if they wait that long, it's usually because it's a pain as opposed to trying to get ahead of it and be proactive.
I mean, I think one of the interesting things, of course, product marketing is there's always going to be more that you could do than that you will do, and it is prioritization. Far more so than many other jobs. Like if you're in finance, for example, you're not going to say, "Oh, shall I close the books this month? I don't know if that's a priority for me. If I should do something else." I mean, many roles in companies have, far more imperatives in them than product marketing, where your goal is to help the business, and there's 1,000 things you could be doing. So it's always about prioritization, which means in a way that PMMs, I suppose, shouldn't feel bad if they wake up one day and realize that CI is also part of their jobs.
Yeah.
And I think that we have to argue that you can debate at what point there should be a full-time CI person, but I think something which is less debatable is that until such time as there is a full-time CI person, you are the CI person if you're in product marketing, even if there's only one of you in the company.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
I would, yeah.
Yeah. So, which is interesting for our listeners. So what that means, in case you didn't realize, is that you are, unless there's a CI department in your company, you are the CI department. So congratulations. Congratulations once again. But let's say for those folks who are in a fairly small product marketing organization, there's hundreds of companies like that who don't have a CI function yet. What should they do? How should you start to do some useful competitive work? But given the constraints that we know that teams like that have, how do you get started?
Yeah. My advice with a lot of things like this is to follow the data. And so what we'll generally try to talk to our customers about too is like thinking about who are the biggest threats to the pipeline. So how many deals are competitive? Some of this is probably going to have to be qualitative because the CRM hygiene isn't going to be perfect. Let's face it. But how many deals are competitive? Who are we coming up against? What is our win rate against them? And then you can start to prioritize. And I think the important part of this is really partnering with your sales enablement peers, the sales leaders as well, and getting agreement on which competitors you're going to prioritize enablement on. That creates the buy-in because you are going to, as a PMM, you're going to have and be able to create a really strong relationship with sales, so you can get that feedback loop. How is this content working? What are you hearing that I should, update on a battle card if that's the asset you're creating? Those sorts of things. So I think once you have those baseline assets for folks, it's then that your challenge next is how do you keep that up to date and relevant so people know where they can go to get trusted information on those deals. And then hopefully you're able to then demonstrate the influence that content has on revenue. So, this again might be qualitative to start with, but after deals close, talking to reps, hey, what content did you use to actually help you on this deal? And it's like, oh, we use this battle card. Okay, cool, that's great. And then you can start to hopefully justify additional budget, build out that function. And that's one way to, I think, a lot of these get started without being fully reactive. Like we've missed 3 quarters in a row, we're losing to competitors, we got to do something. That puts the PMMs in a pretty tough spot where a lot of pressure is going to be on them. So if you can get ahead of it, that's always going to be best.
Taking into account the fact that they need to be updated is very important, because it's a different sort of a thing to plan for, right? I mean, It's planning to, okay, maybe in the next, month or so, we could get a couple of battle cards out and then we breathe a sigh of relief and go back to our day jobs. But how often do they need to be updated? Obviously, it's going to vary, of course, by industry. But, what would be the sort of guiding figures for how often you need to update your competitive stuff?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't think there's like one single answer. So it's probably less about how often should something be updated, but how often should it be validated? So you might have something that was last updated in terms of fresh content 3 months ago or 6 months ago, but it still might be accurate and valid. And so it's some way to stamp the content to say, hey, this has been updated or validated, let's say within the last 30 days or 60 days. And that will, if you're doing that as a PMM, you're going to get the confidence of the sales team who looks at an asset and says, okay, this is up to date. I feel confident using it. So I think that's an important piece. And then having a way to, again, how do you know what to update? So you've got to be able to keep a pulse on what's happening with your competitors, and that's tracking news on them, maybe changes on their website, feedback from sales. Again, really digging into win-loss analysis. It's a gold mine of information there. Slack and Gallon that we talked about. If you have access to those tools, you can use that intel to refresh your content.
So yeah, you were saying earlier the prioritization exercise, something that you should do with sales, figure out, I guess, start with a couple of competitors, which, I mean, I suppose they might be the obvious, the 2 main competitors that the company has, but perhaps not in every situation. There could be companies where if sort of day in, day out, the salespeople are always competing with one of these people, they might just be so practiced at it that that's not really where they have the gaps. I suppose there must be cases where, it might be the, competitors number 3 and 4 that you want to get more information on. Or it could be newer competitors, perhaps, competitors that are coming along recently and causing damage. Now, when it comes to prioritization, right? So if this is a PMM team that's going to decide, okay, CI is a priority I should be working on now, what would be a sign of that? I mean, if you were sitting in a PMM role right now, and you'd been there for for a year or so, and you'd been doing your job, and you've been doing your positioning, and you're launching your products and doing your other stuff, what's the signal that would say to you, hey, maybe I've been under prioritizing CI compared to my other activities?
Yeah, I think one of the signals would be, at least on the sales side, is reps are not going to be shy about sharing information about why they're losing deals. And if it's a competitor and it's feature functionality, generally you're going to see that information in win-loss notes. You're going to see that information again in Slack. You're going to hear it anecdotally. And then when it comes to existing customers as well, if customers are churning because of things that you don't have and competitors do, those are things you're going to want to get ahead of. So I think you've got to find a way to keep track of win-loss. I would probably anchor on that. That's going to be the lagging indicator, and then trying to understand, what are the leading indicators. So if you're looking into, say at this point in time, looking into Q4, looking into Q1 next year, what does the pipeline look like? Do we have pipeline coverage? What types of companies are we selling into? And are there any similarities in terms of, firmographics or technographics that gives us some signals to say, hey, you know what, we're probably going to be coming up against these common competitors over and over. Why don't we provide some enablement on this to sort of future-proof that pipeline a bit? And then that's a very common thing that I think marketing and sales is always trying to align on, and just adding competitive as a component feels like just a natural thing to do, as opposed to something brand new that people have to try to learn.
So let's say companies are doing competitive. They decided to start off by doing a little bit of competitive. Eventually it scaled up. They hired maybe a first CI analyst. What does the scaling process look like for CI? How does it scale out? Is it about hire more analysts? What's the role of technology? Are there things that people are not able to do at an early stage in their CI enablement, which they'll end up doing later? What does that picture look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's partly depend on the type of product or products you sell, and whether you have regional considerations and different competitors in different regions and those sorts of things. But generally speaking, I would say you want your product marketing team to really deeply understand the market, to deeply understand the competitors in the space and how you differentiate from them. So I think from a scaling perspective, what we see as effective is the PMM is not the only person, or the CI person should not be the only person who is responsible for gathering or contributing intel. So ways to scale would certainly be technology can scale in terms of capturing data from all sorts of different sources, so a human doesn't have to do it. How you curate that content can scale. So what we see as really effective and you could do this in smaller companies too, but it's almost this like tiger or SWAT team concept. So get some subject matter experts, because I guarantee you that your AEs, your solution engineers or sales engineers, they're developing their own competitive assets to use anyways. So get all of those minds together, create that single source of truth. And then once you have that, it's then about distribution. So one of the best ways to scale is to create a self-serve way for reps to get intel. So they're not coming to the PMM every time with questions. They know where to go. And integrating that content into tools that, particularly for sales, that sales already uses. No salesperson or sales leader is going to say, we want another tool, right? But so if you can have your content integrated into existing workflows, you minimize change management, you minimize adoption friction. So put your competitive assets in Salesforce, put them in your CMS, make them accessible in places like Slack and Microsoft Teams. I think those are great ways to try to scale out the process of not just gathering the content, but creating it and then getting people to consume it.
Let's talk about technology, because you work for a CI technology company. And when I think about competitive intelligence, you talk about information gathering, right? And so one assumes that, artificial intelligence, right, is going to be something that's going to help to go and bring information in to CI systems, sort of maybe listen, find out what's going on. I'm interested sort of in catching up in a minute on what's possible today, and also where do you see this going in the future? I mean, I remember, it was a long time ago, 20 years ago, I got my first look at a piece of tech from someone. I was working at Business Objects. It was one of the many sort of entrepreneurs who stopped by and said, hey, look, made some tech. It's pretty cool, isn't it? And I thought, wow, it is. Because, what it did was he was doing sentiment analysis on text, which would have been on the World Wide Webs, at that time.
Yeah.
So he was able to sort of reach out and say how is the way that people are feeling about stuff changing, right, over time. And I was imagining, wow, this could be done on internal emails, or you could. I was thinking you could stick microphones in the coffee room, and then you could turn it into XML, and you could see how your employees would do. I mean, there's sort of it's a little bit spyish, but there's got to be a lot of interaction between ways of collecting information using AI and other stuff and CI. So tell me, and I also think it's fair to assume there's no AI robots yet who are replacing competitive intelligence analysts. So sort of how much help can technology be today? First of all, what can it do?
Yeah. So I think on the collection of intel first. So let's say you're a company that has even just 5 primary competitors. You're going to have a lot of secondary competitors. You're going to have a lot of like point solution type competitors. So some might call those ankle biters. And then there's going to be all these other up and coming emerging ones that you don't know about necessarily until you see that they just raised, like, nowadays probably a 20 million Series A, right? So it's really tough to keep a pulse on all of that, and particularly when we're talking about product marketers whose dedicated job is not CI. So how can they use technology to stay on top of that? And so I think it's a way to have a tool like Klue that lets you say, here are all the competitors I'm interested in tracking news about. And that can be stuff, again, that is in press releases, is in blogs, is on review sites, Reddit forums, like, you name it, right? And bringing all of that information into one centralized spot. But the challenge is, how do you take Google Alerts as a good example, which probably a lot of the listeners are using or have used. You can plug in your terms and it does a pretty good job, but your challenge is you're getting news from all sorts of different sources. How do you know what the best source is? How do you prevent duplicates and all these things? And if you're tracking a couple of competitors, probably not a big deal. If you're trying to track 10, 20, 30, that becomes overwhelming, and there's just too much noise. So what the technology can do usually with some kind of machine learning is trying to understand what are the best sources of intel. And so how do you eliminate the noise? So how do you go from, let's just say it's like 100 articles down to 5 and say, this is the recommended content you should read. Now you're shrinking that change and helping product marketers get into this rhythm of saying, okay, whether it's 10 minutes a day or 30 minutes a week, I'm going to focus on trying to catch up with what my competitors are doing. And that's the type of thing technology can help. And generally what the product marketers are going to care about is they don't want to miss anything. So they don't want to be in a position where some exec is sending them something to say, hey, why didn't we know about this? And so having a tool or way to collect all that information and, again, try to promote what is important to them or what might be important is one way that we think that can scale.
Where do you think this might end up going? Do you have any sort of ideas about where this might will end up in the future?
Yeah, it's super interesting to try to think about the potential of where the tech can go with, machine learning has a long way to go for sure. But there's some cool things happening out there. AI, there's a lot of really interesting things happening with AI as well. And so you look at like OpenAI and different tools like that are writing copy for marketers and different things. And might there be a day where summaries of news that are coming in are just like, maybe AI is generating that, and there's tech that does that today, right? So the challenge is how do we make that relevant to my business? Because there's so much context that you have to try to understand. And so I don't think the human is ever replaced, but if you can get the noise down to how do I get all of this intel into some sort of insight that I can then add my point of view and say, here's why this matters to my company, then that's where I think we can add a lot of value. The AI side is also really fascinating to think about, and we're already seeing this with a number of the products out there. So take Zoom that we're using right now, and how fast that's accelerated, especially since March of 2020. And Zoom apps, which didn't exist before, and now a bunch of those are coming to market. And the ability to, Gong is very similar, just the ability to scan transcripts and surface what might be relevant insights based on terminology, sentiment, to your point before. And so there's a lot of applications for competitive with these sorts of things. So if I'm talking to you as a prospect or a customer, you might mention some phrase or a term specifically, and that's some signal that, hey, maybe there's like an objection for me to handle here, and your playbook of what to say pops up. So these are some of the things that are cool to think about to make, how do you create content and then embed the content into the context of what a sales rep, customer success person, product person needs at that moment in time. I think that's really exciting to think about.
Yeah, that's some cool stuff to look forward to. And it also looks happily as though people in CI are not about to be immediately replaced by robots. Anyway.
No, we don't think that'll be the case. Yeah.
That's good. Well, I think we're coming towards the end of our time today. So perhaps just in closing, going back to this scenario where we've got some, PMMs are just thinking of, dipping their toes into the world of CI. Any final words of advice for those product marketers?
Yeah, I think my advice would be tie your work to revenue. So you in your roles will be able to have a significant impact on helping your company improve win rates, increase your ACV, decrease deal duration, all things that marketing is generally tasked with helping drive. And then your ability to influence revenue in your business is really going to accelerate your own individual career progression faster than your peers who can't show they impact revenue. And you'll become invaluable to your internal stakeholders. And those relationships are going to help you in your current company. They're going to also help you in the future as you grow your network. And I would never underestimate that.
That sounds like very good advice to me. Thank you so much, Adam, for joining me today. It's been a great pleasure chatting to you and catching up on this stuff.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me. It was lots of fun.
Thank you for tuning into This is Product Marketing, brought to you by Product Marketing Hive, a product marketing community that gives back. Check out our website, productmarketinghive.com, to join our community, meet fellow product marketers, and access free resources, including training, playbooks, templates, and events. If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe and give a 5-star rating on the platform of your choice. See you next time.